So our agenda for today is to talk about how to find open educational resources to use and modify in your online courses or other open projects. And we're going to be walking you through some of the strategies, resources, and workflows that you can implement so that you can implement the process of finding and incorporating other open materials appropriately into your courses. We're going to go over licenses, common issues when adapting OER, strategies for finding it, workflows for finding open educational resources, and then, of course, support here at UBC. So I'd like to start with a question, and I'm going to go ahead and ask you to put your answers in the chat. We're just going to take a 1 minute. When we talk about open resources, what makes a resource open? How do you know that it's open? If you want to pop your answer into the chat, that would be perfect. Free, that's a great answer. Yeah. Free to access and use for educational purposes, no fees. Perfect. Permission to reproduce, so the ability to reuse. Yeah. Open source. Yeah, these are all fantastic. Google Images indicates that it's free for use. Perfect. I'm going to start with the formal definition of open educational resources. So these are teaching and learning and research materials, including full courses, course materials, textbooks, streaming videos, test software, any other tools or materials or techniques that are free of cost, and access barriers, and which also carry legal permission for open use. And generally, the legal permission is granted through the use of an open copyright license, such as Creative Commons license, which allows anybody to freely use, adapt, and share the resource anytime and anywhere. So using OER is a great strategy for online course content because it saves you, instructors, time and money. So there's no need to gain permission to pay to use or copy or redistribute the open resources, and it's easy to circulate amongst a unlimited number of students. It also makes it really easy for instructors to provide meaningful contextualized resources for your students. So when you adapt the OER, you can use it or edit it or change it or modify it, generally without fear of copyright infringement. You can change the content to suit students' needs, your teaching method, your curriculum goals. And there's millions of open resources available to use in courses and share with. I'd also just like to state up front that OER does save students time and money as well. So online versions, as people were putting into the chat, are free for students and instructors to use. So there's no access codes for them to need to access the materials. But more importantly, or as importantly, there's also no expiration date. So they're able to retain the learning materials for their courses. And I do also just want to add a quick note about cost as an accessibility factor. So according to the 2019 AMS Academic Experience Survey, in which they go out and survey undergraduate and graduate students at UBC, over 71% of UBC Vancouver undergraduate students have gone without textbooks or resources due to cost at least once. And 35% of students report that they frequently or often go without textbooks due to cost. So if a third of a course or a third of students are not able to access the learning materials, to me, that becomes a teaching and learning issue. I also just like to note this other factor that comes out of this survey, that they found 16% of both graduate and undergraduate students reported experiencing food insecurity. So that they were unsure of the ability to obtain food or feed oneself on a monthly basis. So affordability of learning materials is a thing that does happen at UBC. With that, going in a little bit more to what makes a resource open, I like to talk about David Wiley, who's a leading scholar in open education, and his framework that he calls the 5 R's, or 5 of open content. So he says that the more rights, more of these 5 R's are embedded within the open content, the more open they are. And the first is the right to retain. And this is the right to make, own, and control copies of the content. So download, duplicate, store, or manage the content. The right to reuse. So this is the right to use the content in a wide range of ways, for example, in a class, in a study group, on a website, in a video. The next is the right to revise, and this is the right to adapt, adjust, modify, or alter the content itself. The classic example is translating our course content into another language to make it more available or easy to use for different communities. The next one is the right to remix, and this is the right to combine the original or revised content with other open content to create something new. We often talk about this as a mashup, but a pretty common scenario on this is taking different chapters from from different open textbooks and combining them into a textbook that's specific to the course that you're actually teaching. And then finally, there's the right to redistribute. So that's the right to share copies of the original content, your revisions, or your remixes with other people. For example, giving the content to your friend, giving it to your students, allowing those students to then give them to their friends as well. So Wiley argues that the more these R's, as I mentioned earlier, these 5 rights are allowed, the more open our work or set of materials are, and generally these rights are confirmed through the use of open copyright licenses. And I'm just going to go in briefly into open copyright licenses. So this is a classic scenario. An instructor is putting together a module or a video, and we need some images to help illustrate the information that she is creating or wants to share in the video. She goes out to a specific website like Google Images to find the photos or information she needs. However, in order to be able to use the images legally, she needs permission of the copyright holder to be able to use them. Copyright at its most basic is simply the right to control who can make copies of one's work. So the person who creates the work can say who can make copies of this. So in this case, the instructor is not able to use this image as it's copyrighted without RIA's permission. And I do just want to say in as an aside that in the case of materials used in the classroom or in Canvas, the use of copyrighted and third-party materials can be acceptable because of fair dealing exceptions, but those exceptions can be both limited and complex. We're not really going to go into fair dealing in this session, but the library has a whole copyright office to help navigate the complexity of copyright, and we'll share the link to their office in our resources. So this issue of needing permission from the copyright holder to be able to reuse work really came to age in the internet era. As the internet took off, it made the technical sharing of resources really easy, and lots of people actually really wanted other people to reuse their work. But copyright in most countries is automatic. And at the same time, stronger copyright laws are making it more difficult. Creative Commons was started, it was originally out of the US, but it's an international nonprofit organization whose mandate is to make it easier for creators to share their work or to build upon the works of others consistent with the rules of copyright. So Creative Commons licenses are not separate from copyright, they are within copyright. And they created licenses that indicate how people may be able to reuse the creator's work. And the license can really just be thought as a legal form of permission for the reuse under specific conditions. So in a way, Creative Commons licenses are just a form of copyright permission, same as writing to somebody and saying, can I have permission to use your work? Except they do it in advance and they allow others to use, distribute, and build upon works. They actually give creators more options in determining how the work is shared or used, more control and flexibility around their intellectual property. And the way they do that is for the conditions that creators can choose when applying a Creative Commons license to their work. And these are the most common ones. So at the top, you'll see the Creative Commons CC BY, that's a attribution condition. And this license lets others remix, adapt, and build upon one's work, even commercially, as long as they credit the original creator of the work. This is the most accommodating of all the licenses offered, and it's recommended for maximum dissemination and use of licensed materials. The next one is a CC BY no ND, it's often called. So this license down here. So ND stands for no derivative works, and it means that others can only copy, distribute, or display or perform verbatim copies of the work. And this, as somebody who works in education, generally means that those works have to be used as is, so you're not able to adapt them or modify them. So I generally don't recommend non-derivative openly licensed works. The next condition is a share-alike, and this is the others can distribute or reuse as long as they're applying a open license to it identical to the one that you've chosen your work. So sometimes this is called the Trojan horse of Creative Commons licenses. So somebody might go out and they might take a openly licensed book chapter and incorporate it in their book and make a modified version of that book. But the new resulting derivative copy must also be openly licensed. So then an open license must be applied to it. And then the final condition is non-commercial, and this allows others to copy, distribute, display, or perform the work, but only for non-commercial purposes only. And I do just like to state that the Creative Commons organization doesn't really define what commercial means, but it's generally understood to be the use of the work and not the organization or the the institution using the work. So often we think of the university as being a non-commercial space. So if we took an image and we put that into, say, a video we're producing for a course, that would be a non-commercial use. But if we took that same image and put it on a postcard or put it in a textbook, and that postcard or textbook was for sale, that would be a commercial use and not allowed in those commercial purposes. There's also a Creative Commons license that allows the creator to waive copyright conditions, and put their work into the public domain as well. So almost all licenses, if you look over here at this column, require at least an attribution to them. And this is good scholarly practice. We always want to cite our sources. So we want to cite the creators of the work when we're using open work. So going back to our scenario, this is the exact same photo. The photo was taken by Rie. Rie is still the copyright holder. However, what is different is her work is now licensed under a Creative Commons license, either by putting the license on the description page of her photo or indicating that the photo is Creative Commons license directly on the photo. And as long as the instructor provides an attribution or a citation to Rie, the instructor can distribute, remix, adapt, and build upon the image without needing to do any more permissions work. So a quick question that often gets asked is, what's the best licenses to be using? And the licenses I generally say are the ones that allow you to remix, reuse, and redistribute the item without seeking additional permission. I do generally shy away from the non-derivative because often the power of OER is the ability to adapt them for our teaching context. And those materials that have a non-derivative license don't generally allow them to be adapted or changed or modified. A classic scenario that I always talk about is the idea of a map. This was a presentation that I was involved in once where someone had taken a map and they were showing a derivative copy where they had taken the map and they had shaded or highlighted the area that they're specifically talking about in their class. So they had shifted the color to call out a region. And the person who had actually created the original map was in there and they said, I put a non-derivative license, and by shading that region, you're making a derivative copy. You're not using the map as is. So it was a fine, and it was a fine moment. Everything worked out, but it was sort of a quick example of why maybe you don't want to use non-derivative. You're not actually able to modify in a way that would be important for educational purposes. So I just want to go back to the chat really quickly. Have you ever used something that had a Creative Commons license? Have you ever added a Creative Commons licenses to something that you've created? Great, yeah, adding Creative Commons licenses to teaching materials, fantastic. Used but not added, perfect. What does a Creative Commons license look like on a resource? So we'll go a little bit about how to add what a Creative Commons license might work on a resource in a little bit. Perfect. Aaron put the link in. I'm going to go ahead and then turn it over to Aaron's part on getting into finding open educational resources. Oops, sorry.
Great, thank you, Will. There's been some really great questions coming into the chat. Keep them coming. We'll be happy to keep answering those. So open education resources, the biggest issue that we hear from faculty is not just about the time, like getting the time to find the resources to use in their courses, but it's really where to find the resources. And the fact is that there is no single one space where you're going to find open education resources. They exist everywhere. And the metadata or information to find them is often not standardized, so it can be complicated as to where you're going to search for them. So what I'm going to do today is show you a few spaces that you can look that have been curated a bit more. So a little different than a Google search, although I will show you how to optimize your Google searching. But the curated spaces that will have the probably the most authoritative open educational content and the easiest ways in which to search for them. So we're going to take a look at what's available in terms of open access at UBC, and I'll point out a few open textbook collections that exist. We'll also talk about open educational resource repositories that will go beyond textbooks, so it might have quiz banks, PowerPoint, any number of videos or images, and again, optimizing your Google searching. So first I want to talk about UBC Library. So UBC Library hosts several kinds of open materials with varying licenses. So there might be some that have Creative Commons 1 and then others that have Creative Commons 4.0. The issue with the material at UBC Library is we prioritize research materials. So we will have open access content that might be textbooks or monographs, any kind of book, or journal articles or journals themselves. But if you're looking for other sort of resources like the videos or quiz banks or those sort of things, they aren't really indexed inside of the UBC Library collections. But I still want to focus on showing you how to use our collections in order to find what we do have available in terms of open access. So on the general search on UBC Library's homepage, you can filter your results to find open access materials and some materials that can be reused and potentially remixed. Many of them are just reuse, so you can share them, but you can't modify them, again, because they're research-based materials and not educational-based materials. So once you get to the research results screen from the library homepage, you're going to make sure to take a look at open access filter that is on the left side of the right here, that left-hand side, and click that. And what that's going to do is make sure that all of the resources that come back when you do your search are going to be resources that are in the open, that are open access and have an open license. Additionally, what you can do is at the top here, you can click off the button that said add results beyond your library's collection. So usually when you're searching in UBC Library, what you are searching is what we own in terms of the collections we purchase, whether they're electronic or physical. But we also purchase the database that you're searching when you're searching UBC Library, which is more than what UBC owns. So you can actually click that button to find additional resources outside of UBC Library. And then finally, we have the open version of content, which is called unpaywall. So sometimes you might find an actual item that is not considered open because it's inside of a journal or it's been published by a publisher that is a closed system. But unpaywall will provide you with access to a version of that object that might have been the prior to editing, and the author was allowed to post it inside of a repository, which means you can get access to a version of the object, maybe not the final published version, the official published version, but the preprint. So you can use unpaywall here in order to do that. Just moving forward, I also wanted to mention some of UBC Library's collections that we develop. So on the UBC Library, in the UBC Library collections, we have something that is called Open Collections. It's a good place if you're interested in finding digital photos, books, newspapers, maps, videos. But again, there is a bit of a bent to the kind of material that you're finding there. Most of it is historical. We're digitizing our archival collections, or it's local material. So we really prioritize BC content in this space. It also contains material from Circle, which is UBC's institutional repository, which contains the research and educational outputs of UBC faculty and community members. So there may be content within inside of Circle that could be used within your course that is useful. You're going to want to, again, pay attention to the license. I'm going to say that over and over again, because the licenses will vary by object. So some might be Creative Commons and some might require you to request permissions from rare books and special collections at UBC in order to use it in some way in your material. So just pay attention to that. But a lot of the image collections are Creative Commons 4.0. So that means that they are available for that open use. So now to talk about open textbook collections, there's been like a proliferation of open textbook development, I'd say within the past 10 years. You might be aware of some of these collections, in particular with BC open textbook collections, but these are basically collections of very common textbooks, primarily focused on large undergraduate populations. So like a biology 100 level will probably have a significant number of open textbooks that are available. The purpose for these open textbook collections is really focusing on the barriers, the financial barriers when students are accessing their courses and their course content. And a textbook can be anywhere from a few $100s to well over that from the medical sciences. So we do have a number of open textbook collections that are being developed. BC Open Textbook Collection is from BC campus. You may see a lot of funding opportunities that come from them around open education resource development. So that's a quite fulsome collection that also is it's gone through peer review by faculty. So there is a feeling of comfort in knowing that there is a peer review process, whereas some open education resource collections, not necessarily has it gone through that sort of peer review piece. It also has gone through accessibility requirements, accessibility and inclusivity, so that the actual textbook itself can be used, for example, for people who have vision impairment, they can use it with a reader. Other collections that I would mention is the Open Textbook Library. This one is actually more of an aggregator of a number of open textbook collections. So it's more of a served up database interface to use search across a number of these. So for example, OpenStax, SUNY, and BC Open Textbook Collections is inside of the Open Textbook Library database. I should mention that all these open textbooks have the Creative Commons licenses attached. So even if the full textbook is not necessarily something that you're interested, it is available for you to adapt. So you can take some sections, parts, modify it, change it in any ways that actually would be useful for you. And we do have supports related to open textbook development through UBC Library. And if that's something of interest, do let me know. So now I'm going to talk about open educational resource repositories. So usually, again, when people are searching for open educational resources, they tend to use what they're used to, which would be Google and Google searching. But there are repositories that have been developed that particularly house open educational resources. And the benefit of using these repository space is that you're getting a curated space of content that has gone through some metadata structure, so that when you do searching, it's going to pull up objects all at one search that would be useful for you. But there are 3 different types of open educational resource repositories. I just wanted to go through those a bit so you'll understand when you're searching across them why some of the search functionality might be a little complicated. So there is the resource archive, and a resource archive is a repository where you can upload your resource to the repository and it will live there. And this is helpful in that you don't want to host your own resource. So if you have like a video or images and you upload them to, say, Wikimedia Commons, it's a place where they now exist and you don't have to maintain a personal website or something like that in order to make them accessible. So there would be that space that just maintains it. It has very limited search functionality, but it is available for searching. Then there's the resource aggregators. These aggregators are repositories that collect the metadata from resource archives or resources that are on other websites. So basically, they're just pulling resources from everywhere into one space so that you can search across a bunch of repositories. So when I was mentioning the Open Textbook Library, that's an aggregator. It's one search interface searching across multiple collections. And these are really helpful for you to be able to do a big sweeping search. So I would always suggest that if you're going to just start your searching, rather than trying to find a repository that is specific to your subject area, that might be very narrow, searching across an aggregator will give you a bit more content than searching just individual subject specialized space. And then there are archive aggregators, which do a bit of both, which means you can use it to upload content and it will host the content, but it also pulls in content from other areas to search. So it's a bit of both of those options together. Now, to show you just one example of this, or I mentioned two, but I will show you an example, and I'll do a search on one, is these two are aggregators, well, one is an aggregator, the other one's an aggregator archive, but Oasis basically searches across 98 sources of open content. So basically, they're searching across those open textbook collections. They're searching across different open repositories in one search interface. Mason OER Finder actually does the same thing, searching across 21 different sources of open. Now, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a look at Oasis. Just give me one moment as I search for that screen. Sorry, it's seeming to have a bit of an issue pulling it up. Okay, this should work now. Okay, so you should see Oasis. Forgive me if you don't. Oh, geez. Will, could you confirm that you can see Oasis?
I can see it, yeah.
Thank you. Great, so here's Oasis, which is an aggregator across a number of different sources of open education spaces. So if I actually click on sources here at the top, you'll see the 97 different spaces that it's searching across when you're searching for open content. So it's quite fulsome. I will mention that when you're searching inside of these spaces, keeping a search quite general and broad is necessary, and I'll explain why in a moment. But let's just search generally for biology. And here we have our almost 2,000 results. It tells you by type of item that you find. So if you're only looking for video content, you can limit down just to videos. And then it tells you source as well as licensing information, which is quite useful here. Because if you're looking specifically for objects that you want to be able to modify, you can actually select that license in order to ensure that you can make modifications and changes to the object. Now, the reason why I say you have to do a pretty general search when you're searching in Oasis is because the Oasis is searching across so many different sources, it's actually doing what's called a keyword title search. So it's only searching within the titles of the actual records of the objects. The reason for that is that every single different source that it's searching across has different metadata, which means different information about the objects. So to try and make one search work across all of them is quite complicated. So it's better quite simple, and what you're going to have to do is take a look at the actual objects themselves to see if they are what you want them to be, if they're actually useful for you. So it's a little bit more work, unfortunately, but it's still the best way to see if the objects are going to actually be of use. Now you will notice that when I say clicked on one of the objects, it pulls you into a different interface. That's again because it's aggregating, it's looking across platforms, so it's not housing the objects there. So it will shoot you to the place where that object exists. It is always important to check the license again. The reason I mention this is if you do not check the license, sometimes the metadata that's been pulled across is incorrect. and the license is different from what you expected it to be. So always check the license where the object actually resides, rather than relying on OASIS to have given you the correct information. I think I just saw, can you repeat that? Yes. So when you're looking at an, oh, maybe it's Will that is answering that, but let me share the screen one more time. I'm going to go back to my slides. Forgive me just a moment. And I'll find the slide where I was at, and then I'll just reinforce what I said so that we're on the same page. So basically, when you're searching within one of these interfaces, I'm just saying that you always want to make sure that the license of the object that you're interested in, that you found from, say, OASIS, that that license is in fact correct, that they've pulled in and they've tagged the correct information on that license, because sometimes the metadata has not transferred correctly, and the license that's been tagged in OASIS is actually not correct according to the actual object itself. So once you're looking at the object, always make sure to check the license of that object. And if you are ever confused about whether an object is available for you to use, you can always contact the library and ask us, and we can do an assessment on it. So I just mentioned here that there is a full resource that's been developed on finding open educational content. So we have an open education guide, and within that guide, there's OER repositories that we've selected and done a thorough review on to make sure that there are quality spaces that are continuously updating and more content is being added. We've also separated the repositories out into by material. So if you're looking for an open textbook, we have a list of spaces you can search, or if you're looking for images, we have lists of spaces that you can search for open images. And then also subjects. So some subjects are better than others. There's a lot of repository content in the sciences, less so in the arts, but we do list the spaces you can search for open content by subject area. And the last thing I do want to mention before I pass it back to Will is optimizing your Google search. So we are all going to be using Google to do searching. It's just kind of ubiquitous at this point. But what I want to mention is that you can actually search Google a little bit more narrowly. And limit down by license type. So when you do a Google search, for example, here on the screen, I'm searching for Italian and grammar. What I want to do is I want to go to the settings button. And within the settings button, there's advanced search. And once you've selected that, the advanced search actually allows you to select the type of license that you want. When you're searching using Google. So you can say that I want to search for only content that's free to use, share, or modify. And if you select that, it will narrow down your search significantly. Now, I will say again, you're going to want to check once you found an object in Google and you want to use that object, always go to the page to take a look at the license there to make sure that that object is in fact open for you to use, share, or modify. The reason I mention that is sometimes websites are complicated and objects might have different licenses. So one object will have a Creative Commons license and another object might not. So what you're going to want to do is always make sure that the individual object on a site is in fact open by looking at that object itself. If there is no license that's been attached to an object, you're going to want to look on the website for terms of use statement. And in the terms of use statement, it will tell you how the objects can be used and whether you're allowed to post them, modify them, share them, etc. Again, this does sometimes get complicated. The library is always there to help you do that assessment should you need. All right. So before we switch over to Will, who's going to talk a bit about adapting, I just wanted people to share if they have any tools that they use to find open resources. It's always nice to hear if there's something new out there. Maybe before we switch over to Will, I will answer this one question that came in because it's a very important one, which is So sometimes authors are posting articles on ResearchGate or academia.edu as PDFs. And whether that is an okay kind of use in terms of open access, that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual article is open access. There would have to be some sort of statement on the article that says that this article is free to use, etc. But also there is some instances where academia.edu and ResearchGate are definitely having people post content that is not actually available because the authors have signed an agreement with their publisher that rescinds their copyright, meaning that the copyright ownership is now with the publisher and not with the author. So you have to be kind of careful when you're dealing with your intellectual property rights and when you're signing those agreements to see how you're allowed to use that object. Sometimes it'll say you're allowed to post the preprint of an object before it's been edited, in which case that is fair for a person to share that. But it's all going to depend on what you've signed away. So you can't necessarily guarantee what's been posted in ResearchGate or academia.edu is fair for you to use unless there is a copyright statement in the object itself. And other than that, Will, feel free to take us to the next part.
Great. I saw someone mention that they use platforms such as Flickr, which allows people to post Creative Commons license in the metadata of images, which is great. And I'll just throw out another. My favorite is Wikipedia and Wikimedia Commons, which is the file space for Wikipedia. Everything in that is generally open license for reuse as well. So it's also a great source of not just Wikipedia type content, but images and charts and graphs often as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about using and adapting open resources. So after you find them, but I'm just going to reiterate what Aaron said, that you want to make sure that you understand the license requirements when you find something. So always double check the license on the actual material. So often if you're doing a Google search to find images and it's pulling up Flickr images, you'll want to click through and drill down to that actual Flickr page where the image is in the metadata. So when thinking about using material, I think these are great questions to always ask yourself. So can you reproduce the material? Are you allowed to change it? So what are the license conditions? Do you know how to do the attribution for it? And again, just be aware of the source site's terms of services and individual items specific license, because some sites have blanket licenses and some sites have item level licenses. So paying attention to that will make things go much smoother. So almost all open licenses require an attribution. So again, attribution is an important requirement, but it's also an important scholarly practice that you should already be mostly familiar with doing. So we always say cite your sources, and that's the same for open educational materials. You just want to make sure that people are receiving credit for the work that they've done and people aren't assuming that you were the original author of that work. Creative Commons itself doesn't really specifically say the format that it should be in, but they do generally recommend that the license information or the citation information contain these 4 elements, often abbreviated TASL. So the title of the work, the author or creator of the work, the source, so what was the original web page that you found it on, and then the license. So the license is letting other people know what permission you have to use the resource. So here's a couple examples coming from Flickr. So this was a image at the top. The title is Castle Author. The creator is Andrea Muselli, which is with their Flickr username Blue Star Drop. The source is just a link to the image on Flickr, and then the metadata for that image shows that they're using a Creative Commons attribution, non-commercial share alike license. So it can be a short hyperlinked attributed statement. So Castle Stalker, the link there goes back to the Flickr image, the author, and then the license information. Hyperlinking the license information to the actual license on Creative Commons does a couple different things. One, it makes it easier for people to understand what permission, if they want to reuse that image, or what permission you have to use it. But it also, Creative Commons licenses have multiple layers to them, and one of the layers is a machine layer. So this is used a lot by search engines like Google, and they're getting better and better all the time, so they can see this license, and if their crawlers go out to the machine layer, and they can read the license, and helps them index open licenses as well. So talking a little bit about OER, the adaptability of R is one of its core features. And again, it allows instructors to fit the resource into your specific course content, allows you to take out what you don't need, add what you do, and allows you to contextualize the work to make it more meaningful to your students. So some classic examples can range from using parts of a biology open textbook and a psychology open textbook to make a new biopsychology, brain and behavior type text. We've seen here at UBC replacing images of families in a social psychology textbook with images of families that are more reflective of the demographics of UBC, making students feel more reflected in their learning materials. I've talked about this one commonly. It's used adding arrows to openly licensed charts or maps to highlight things being discussed in the module. Generally just adding images and videos to course modules is a form of adapting those and bringing them into your course. So I'm just going to provide a sort of common example. Basically, here's an example of a very common scenario. So an instructor, again, wants to create a video or a module or a slide deck and is using images to bring those into it. Sorry. So in this instance, we don't see any citations or sources for these images, so we don't know what the open license is standard in it. So even if they are, if these images being used in this particular resource, we don't know if they haven't actually met the requirements of open attribution or open citation. So they're not meeting the license requirements if these are open work. So this slide used in a video lecture, if an instructor wanted to make this video lecture open and share this image openly, they wouldn't be able to. So just looking at the next example, this is a classic example of the slide meeting Creative Commons license requirements. So you'll see here, it was fairly simple to do because all the images being used are openly licensed images. And all that needs to be done was the proper attribution. In this case, we put the information on the slide itself, but you could also include a slide at the end of the video or at the end of the presentation that lists the resources and citations like endnotes. And you want to make sure you include links again to the resources and to the licenses. In this case, we wanted to say the scenario was that we wanted to make the video openly licensed as well. So we will apply a Creative Commons license to the work. And you'll notice a couple of these licenses are share-alike licenses, so we wanted to make sure, because we've created a derivative piece of work here that's incorporating 3 different open images, that the resulting, to meet the license requirement of using those, we also had to apply a similar license to this work as well. And that's pretty much it, but I will say the number one way open educational resources go, or people using open educational resources can get into trouble, is by not properly citing or knowing where the source of the resource that you're using is coming from. And when you want to make your own resources open, remember you can only share what you have permission to share. So putting a Creative Commons license on your work is great if you want others to use your work, but you can only share works in which you're individually the copyright holder, works that have been made available for reuse. So those are things that are openly licensed, that people are saying, yes, please do reuse these things. And then finally, works that are in the public domain, meaning that the copyright has expired. So these are in Canada currently, that is the creator's lifetime plus 50 years. After that, the works go into the public domain. So talking about using these works, I'm going to turn it back over to Erin to talk a little bit about some of the best practices and workflows for generating or for using open licenses as you build out course materials.
Yeah, so you don't run into that issue if you are creating an open educational resource and you're wanting to use other resources in order to create that. In order not to fall into the pitfalls of having generated an object but not done the requisite work, the attributions, in order to be able to make that work actually an open educational resource, I'm going to show some workflows that are the best way in order to keep track of what you're doing, and so that in the end, once you've completed your object, you can be certain that it is ready to be made openly available. So So when you're finding and incorporating OER into your work, these are the 5 ways that you should follow a sort of workflow in order to develop out a process that is going to be successful at the end, with you assigning the license and letting it be accessible to the general public. So first, wanting to do a copyright check of the materials that you are already including in your OER. So if you have already developed out PowerPoint slides or video or other content and haven't done the requisite work on knowing whether that object can be released into the open, so to everybody, you do want to make sure that those objects are in fact free of copyright or have a Creative Commons license attached or some other open license that allows you to actually share the objects. You're going to want to evaluate and incorporate, or you're going to want to identify resources that you need for your OER, especially if your project is larger. If you're going to be developing out a lab manual, for example, which is a project that I'm currently supporting, you're going to want to think about all the different resources that are needed in order for that lab manual to be complete, so that when you are ready to search for your open education resources, so the videos, the images, questions, PowerPoint slides, that you can develop an adequate search plan, so you're not constantly researching the same spaces for content, hoping for a new set of results. Once you have done that search plan and have done your searching with inside of the different repositories that we talked about, or through Google, making sure to use that search filtering, you're going to compile the resource metadata, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And then finally, evaluate and incorporate the search results. If you need to start again because you haven't found enough, you're going to basically restart the workflow. So what do I mean then by, actually we can skip this one, by the metadata. So the metadata information is the information that you're going to need in order to know essentially the attribution information, so to do a appropriate attribution for the objects that Will just showed you a little while earlier. So what we do in the library when we're supporting people finding content is you develop out basically an Excel sheet that will list the type of sources that you have, who the author is, the title, where it came from, the publisher, date, and all of the information that you will need in order to ensure that the object is okay for you to use, and that once you have finished writing your object, you can create your citation lists or your attribution list. So it's similar processes that you engage in when you're doing research. It's just now it's being applied to educational objects. So if you continuously do this workflow, you will not run into the issue that many open education projects run into, which is a full development has happened, but the actual attribution, metadata collection, and all of that has not actually occurred. And now we have to retroactively go back and take a look at all the elements of the object to ensure it is open for use. So developing these workflows into your project at the outset will save an enormous amount of time and frustration in the end. So we do have templates that are available for developing out the search plan, gathering the correct attribution information, and all of that will send to you at the end of the session. So just to talk then a bit about supports, and then certainly we will answer questions. There are a number of supports that are available from UBC Library for open scholarship projects, and you can find all of that information on the Open UBC website under the consultation section. So we do provide support, of course, related to finding, creating, adapting open educational resources. There's also supports if your open education project may have a particular digital kind of component. There's supports for that. If you want to make your resources openly available, where to put them, the kind of metadata you should attach so that people will find them, there's supports for this as well as open science framework and open research and data workflows. So if you're interested in the research side of open, we have those supports available as well. We also have our open webinar series. This is a part of that series, but this series encompasses a number of related issues on open access, open science, open data, and open education. I believe we have a workshop coming up that is about Pressbooks. So if you're interested in either adapting an open textbook or creating an open textbook using the Pressbooks platform, we do have a workshop coming up next week on this in particular. And we also have a workshop that focuses more down on the copyright, Creative Commons, and open licensure piece. So there's a very much a bigger deep dive into that area as well. We also have had workshops on Omeka. So if you're interested in creating an open gallery or an open, like a museum exhibit, we teach you how to use that tool, and open science framework as well. And finally, just resources and supports that are available. We do have UBC Library Open Education Guide that will provide you all the spaces to search for open content. We have the Open Education or Open UBC Working supports open scholarship activities, and you'll see those under the consultations who those people are. We have a number of templates for finding the OER search plan spreadsheets that you can use for your own OER projects. And we have a number of guides that are very useful. So Open Education Research Guide, we have Copyright Educational Research Resources and Research Guide, as well as Open UBC, which has a number of toolkits, including how to publish an open textbook, so the processes of developing an open textbook, adapting an open textbook, as well as open pedagogy, and a number of others that could be useful if you're interested in engaging in open development.
And just to quickly note on the Open UBC site, last year UBC did create a OER fund to help instructors implement open resources into their courses. And this came really out of advocacy of the AMS, the Student Society here. So there will be a new cycle of grants, implementation grants, so using OER in UBC Vancouver credit courses for up to $25,000. There'll be an announcement about that for the second year of that coming out in September. And then there'll be ongoing what we call rapid innovation grants for just getting started with OER. Those will also launch in September, and those will be monthly $2,000 grants. And with that, I think we're at the end of our presentation, but also please don't ever hesitate to write Aaron or I if you need help or support or just have questions. But we can take some questions now. And one of the questions that came up while you're thinking of questions was demonstrating how you can get Creative Commons license information from metadata. I'm just going to quickly show a Google search, and maybe this gets to your answer. I'm going to share my screen really quick just to go through a Google search briefly. Take just a sec. So I'm just pulling up Google right now. So you'll see Google. I'm going to zoom in. So I might say I'm searching for mitochondria. I'm just going to go ahead and click on. So say I want a chart. Sorry, I'm typing on the wrong screen. So say I want a chart about mitochondria. If I go into Google, I'm seeing sort of the information that comes up. Because it's a chart, I might switch over to images. Under images, as Aaron was talking about, you can go into tools and see usage rights. So this is Google going out and reading the metadata and finding the ones that have Creative Commons. So I'm just going to say label, go for label for reuse, and I'm just going to click on one. So here I can see the chart, but I don't really see the metadata for this. So I'm going to go ahead and click through, and this will take me to the actual source of the image. So this is coming from Wikimedia Commons. Again, this file space for Wikipedia. And I can see this, and this is the actual chart. And if you scroll down, you'll begin to start seeing metadata. And metadata is just the information about the image. So I can see the description, the date when it was created, the source. I'm just going to blow into it. And if you keep scrolling down, and most sites will have this, you'll eventually get to some licensing information. So here, it's the licensing information is that they've shared it under a Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 unported license. And this specifically tells you right here what you're allowed to do: it copy, distribute, transmit, adapt, as long as you provide attribution. So some sites might not have this directly on the image, but they might have something that says usage guidelines or copyright, and you can click on that, and then they'll say what sort of permissions or if it's a site-wide license. Does that answer the question?